Thank you again to the organizers for bringing me back once more. I appreciate being here, and it's always a stimulating discussion in the days before this meeting, and hopefully you will stimulate some thoughts with this talk after Dr. Peterson's introduction here on the topic. One of the things we've been working very hard on in the last year is figuring out how to get better acceptance for chronic fatigue in general and ME as part of a more mainstream research process. And so I'm going to talk a little bit first about how this medicine process functions and how it's changing actually right now, both on the clinical side as well as on the research, and how and why ME/CFS is actually, I think, a really coming to a point where it's going to be a really key disease in moving that type of process forward. And then I'll talk a little bit more about where we are with some of the things that we're doing within OMI and a lot of the collaborators that you'll hear from later on today, and where I think things are going with that. So what we don't want is what's happening here is where the gentleman is saying to the other one in the cube, we're ready to begin the next phase of keeping things exactly the way they are. And we've had way too much of that in this field, not through any of your desires or direction, but largely because the wrong incentives have been in place for too long a time in this field. So I'm going to diverge for a moment and just talk about medicine in general and my biases from where I sit. Our organization sits in the middle of Silicon Valley, which is really a strange place in the world. It's not there aren't that many places like it, but it's particularly strange because there's a lot of disruptive things going on in Silicon Valley, and obviously information technology is one of those, and you hear about those in the news and from some of the companies and so forth that come out of Silicon Valley. And then you hear a lot about this social revolution. You know, Richard just mentioned twittering. I don't know if we had a Twitter feed last year, did we? But there's lots of different social technologies that are really changing the way not only people interact socially, politically, but also actually from a medical space. And of course, we've always talked at this meeting about biotechnology and what's changing there and how that should impact what we're doing both on the research front and hopefully ultimately diagnostically and therapeutically. What we want to do and what's happening very quickly actually is that those three drivers are really changing the way we look at medicine as a whole. And that's actually really good news for chronic fatigue and ME because those three drivers really are going to flip some of the paradigms that we've had for hundreds of years in medicine. So let me turn first to information technology. So this is probably a relatively famous graph. Hopefully many of you have seen this, but maybe if you're not in the computing field, you might not have. This is a graph of Moore's Law. And what Moore's Law says is that every 18 months, processor speeds double in computing technology. So this is just a graph, and you can extrapolate out. I only found one that goes to 96, but this is actually continued out onto on the same trajectory up till this year. So the number of processing units on a computer chip have continued to double every 18 months. And so way back here in 1976, this is the age of the dawn of the PC, right? So we moved the number of processing units from a PC, the room-size computing level down to a PC level. And now we're in 2013 where this phone that many of you carry with you or other brands of this phone is a more powerful computing device than what used to fill the rooms at IBM and so forth. So there's a dramatic shift in what we can do in terms of information. There's also been a dramatic shift in how we store that information. So this is a graph of the dollars per megabyte over time, and you can see a steep drop here, right? So back in 1981, it cost for a 5 megabyte hard drive, it cost $3,500. Well, today We're down at $700 per megabyte. Today we're down past 2 cents. 0.2 cents per megabyte, which is incredible. You can walk into a computing store today and walk out with a terabyte drive for less than $100. And sorry, I don't know what that is in pounds, but it's close. It's 150, yeah. So that's a dramatic change in the amount of information we can store anytime, anywhere, which again puts that kind of a level of information storage on you as a person, potentially. And I'll bring this all back shortly. So the other dramatic change has been in wireless technologies. And how many people in the room have a cell phone? So probably 3/4 of the room at least. This is a graph of cell phone utilization in the United States. And actually, if you took this out to 2013, again, the trajectory keeps going. There are now 2 cell phones for every individual in the United States. Why that is, I'm still not quite sure, but I do know some people who carry 2 or 3, actually. One's for work, one's for home, and we may see that change a little bit as some of these technologies merge and allow you to have 2 lines on a cell phone and so forth. But that's an incredible explosion from 5-10 years ago, where almost no one had a cell phone. And that changes. We're going to use that in terms of changing the paradigm here again. The last area of information technology I wanted to talk about was what people are calling quantified self, or personal technology, or wearable technologies. I have a whole bunch of different examples here of different technologies, some of which have been used by actually some of the investigators in this room, some of which we're just starting to use, and some of which you'll see emerging over the next year. So the one in the middle is my recent favorite. So a good chunk of CFS patients have POTS, and I don't think it's any news to you all. But what do you do when you have POTS? Well, you go to your cardiologist, or you go to your primary, your generalist, and they say, oh, well, you have an irregular heartbeat. I'll send you to the cardiologist. Okay, you go to the cardiologist. Cardiologist says, okay, well, it sounds like you're having irregular heartbeats. Let's put a Holter monitor on you, and typically you'll get that for 24 hours, 48 hours. Maybe if you're lucky, they'll give it to you for a week. And then you come back and you haven't had any events that week. So, okay, well, maybe better luck next time, right? So this is a little plastic case, has 2 little things on the back. It actually fits around my phone. It's made by a company down the street from us in Silicon Valley. And I just turned my phone into an EKG. So we're actually sending patients home with this device. So when they feel those palpitations, they can actually capture that and put some quantification around what before was a very simple symptom for them. I have tachycardia. I'm feeling my heartbeat, irregularly or out of control. Well, I can now document that. I can not only document it on my phone, I can, because it's my cell phone, I can send it straight up into the cloud and straight over into our database, or put it straight in front of a physician who can read it in near real time and give you direct clinical feedback. These other devices are measuring other things. They're measuring activity, they're measuring, so the 2 on the top right there and left are activity meters that also have quantification of sleep activity. The armband here, I know the Norwegians use this particular model, so do we. It measures galvanic skin response as well as activity level. And there's some versions that do heart rate. There's versions these are continuous measurements that we're making. And many of these devices, you either plug them in, like the one on the top right there, plug them into your computer, and it just downloaded the last week of data about you. Or there's a belt clip one that you can wear, and you can see it has a little readout of the number of steps that were taken here by this individual. So it's actually quantifying how much activity you have. And I don't need to tell this audience how important quantifying your activity is, for particularly when you're talking to a physician who doesn't understand what it is that you're going through. Well, how can you document, oh, well, yes, you changed this medication, and yes, I'm doing better because I have more physical activity. I got up and I walked down to the store today, which I couldn't do 2 months ago before I started drug X. So these are important measures, and Dr. Peterson was just talking about outcomes measures. So these are surrogate measures, and some of them are a little bit softer, but some of them are harder than what we've had in the past. But these start to be tools that we can use in very quantifiable ways to document not only what's going on in CFS, but what changes when we prescribe one treatment or another and start to study something. And Dr. Mella and Dr. Fluga have had some very wonderful results doing this in the Rituxan study, as have we around Valcyte and Rituxan. But these are really important tools because they're starting to explode in terms of the number and the variety of tools, not just around activity, but we now are working with a group that actually, again, going to the cell phone, you can plug an EEG in here, right? So I could do a home EEG on all of you with a relatively simple, relatively low-cost device, and most of these devices are dropping in cost very quickly. This device in the middle here on the right, your left side, is a device that's not yet available on the market, but we're working with that company. It's called the Scanadu Scout. And this is actually a nice device because it actually gives us a much better quantifiable set of home vitals. So you actually hold it up to your forehead for about 10 seconds, and it will give you a full readout of all of your vitals, just as if you'd put a cuff on there. There's some limitations, and I'll grant the skeptics in the audience that you can't do differential blood pressures between two arms and so forth. But in 10 seconds, I can gather a lot more information than I could in probably 2 minutes in taking a cuff blood pressure and then taking an O2 sat and so forth that I would do in my own clinic. So we're actually converting, in large sense, to these kinds of devices, even in the clinic setting. So it makes us more efficient, but it also makes us more accurate, and it makes us more standardized across many clinics. And so some of these technologies are really going to come into play very dramatically, I think, in terms of where we're going in ME/CFS research. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So let me shift gears a little bit more, still sort of in the IT realm, but now over to social networking. So we've had this explosion of technology in terms of being able to manage information. We have an explosion of wearable technology in terms of capturing what any given individual is doing at any moment. Well, let me actually, before I do that, go back to the term quantified self, and let me just define that for you. There's a whole movement now, and some of you may be engaged with it, but there's a whole movement now that's sprung out of a couple of different areas, but largely around this conversion of different technologies, and it's about self-quantification. Well, I can't think of a better field that would be more important for ME/CFS than self-quantification, right? It's standardizing how we measure ourselves and how we measure what is my norm as an individual, what is your norm as an individual, what changed when you went on that probiotic, what changed when you went on a new physical regimen, what changed when you went on a drug, and how do I quantify that for myself, for my physician, for a researcher, across a whole population. So it's a bit about bringing some standards in, but it's also about tracking and measuring yourself in new ways. And I think it's as important for each of you as a person, whether you have ME/CFS or not, or as it is to us as physicians to be able to see in a very quick snapshot what's gone on in that individual in any given time frame. Right? We're great in terms of spending, whether it's 15 minutes to an hour with a patient and talking to them and and gathering information, but there's a lot that happens in that week, month, 3 months, 6 months, year between the intervals when we see a patient. And so these kinds of things become extremely important in terms of gathering that information and presenting it to the physician, to the researcher, but also summarizing it for yourselves as patients or as family members of patients so that you can glean more knowledge about yourself and where you're going and what your health level is, if you want to look at it in that context. Okay, so social networking. So I don't think this is going to be, any of these graphs are any surprise to hopefully anyone who's read the newspaper in the last few years, but as you know, we've seen an explosion in terms of social networking. So this first blue graph is a chart of Facebook users. So they've topped 1 billion Facebook users now. Well, Great, many of you probably have a Facebook page, but what does that do for us in CFS? The graph on the right is just to illustrate that actually the numbers are rising across demographics, and I would argue across diseases as well. So the top bar was the early adopters, right, the youngsters. The next one is the next age group. But even among, and I would say that this graph is actually understating it, because I've seen some other studies that have shown more than 50% of AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons, so this is the 65 and older crowd, have internet access and use it on a daily basis. So the numbers here are climbing dramatically in terms of people being connected to one another. And I think that's a critical piece in terms of our discussion of mainstreaming of this research. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit further, the third factor that I talked about was biotechnology. And Silicon Valley, where I live, and there's many hubs like this around the world, but Silicon Valley is a particularly active one in this area. This is a graph of sequencing capacity, for lack of a better word, compared with that hard disk storage doubling time. So you had the graph I showed before, which is charted in a different way. So you've got increasing storage capacity, that's your blue line. Before next generation sequencing, so this is sort of pre-Human Genome Project sequencing, we were following the yellow line, right? So storage is going this way, sequencing is accelerating, but not going super fast. And now, since the Human Genome Project, we have all these new technologies available because of that. And so the graph went from the yellow line to the red line. We now have this explosion of capacity and ability to do sequencing. And the costs for that, which is illustrated by the right side, so this is base pairs per dollar, are shrinking dramatically. So we're at an inflection point where to sequence your entire genome is about to cross the $2,000 mark per individual. And that's the cutting edge, right? Reality is always lagging behind that. So it actually costs, to do a high quality version of that, still is about $10,000 right now, $10,000 to $11,000. But both of those costs are coming down dramatically. To do that, to give you an idea and put that in context, 5 years ago, they finished the first genome, first complete genome, or actually it's a little longer than that now. That was a $1 billion project. So in another 2 years, we will be able to sequence each individual in this room really for a song compared to that. People are expecting sub-$500 genomes in a very short while. So that's giving us a tremendous amount of data. That's, by the way, really important because you can see that those two lines cross. So our ability to generate data is about to outstrip our ability to store it. Uh-oh. Really bad news for us on the research side, because now we've got way too much data to analyze, and that gets reinforced when we look at other technologies. So the technology on the left is what you all have heard about before. These are gene expression arrays. So each spot of light among about 40,000 different spots here represents one single gene that's been turned on or off. And we have computer programs that read these things and know which spots are which, and can read the intensity on each spot and give us point data in terms of time. This individual had this expression pattern at this time point, and we're very busy right now correlating that to, and they were on this drug, or they had these symptoms, and so forth. And this is happening across medicine. One of the areas where this has been most applied has been cancer and lymphoma. But we are now putting that technology to work in chronic fatigue. The slide on the graph on the top right is actually a graph. It's not just a pretty abstract piece of art. This is a colorized image of a new technology that we're just starting to look at and work with another company with, that measures the same kind of thing at the protein level. So we can now have 300,000 protein tags, so different points on different proteins that uniquely identify those proteins from one individual. And that right now costs less than $1,000. So for each individual, with one little drop of blood, it actually doesn't take much, we can pull out 300,000 data points, plus another 400,000 data points, plus your whole genome sequence. And really, we're now under $20,000 with those costs, actually under probably 15. That's pretty incredible. That's a huge amount of data. Now start thinking about that in time series, right? Okay, here's patient X pre-drug, here's patient X post-drug, and you're going to hear about some of these things later on from Maddie Hornig. But this is the kind of thing we're going to start doing on a large scale. So this brings us to a crossroads in medicine. And again, this is across disciplines in medicine. This is not just ME/CFS. The traditional way that we've practiced medicine for hundreds of years has been, as Dr. Peterson indicated, it's followed a pattern, and medicine has been actually relatively slow to change that, appropriately so, because we have to do what we know, and we have to back that up with evidence. But that has produced in the last 10 years this movement of evidence-based medicine or guidelines-based medicine, which is important. But what we're now, with these technologies, are reaching a point where the evidence is still critically important, but the kind of evidence has changed, and the amount of evidence has changed, and we're starting to be able to take that, rather than looking at large groups among a population, so say all of ME/CFS, take some of these technologies and apply them so that we can focus down on one individual or a cluster of individuals as more representative of this disease. So think of it as a profile. This little group right over here has more of a viral profile. This little group over here has more of a autoimmune profile, a group in the back, and so forth. So you start to find clusters within the populations that are more similar or are more dissimilar, and can use those to help make a diagnosis and hopefully ultimately help guide a therapy. And this is here today in fields like oncology. We don't, and Dr. Flugan-Mella can probably tell you way more about this than I can, but we don't anymore just subdivide to, oh, they have cancer, oh, okay, they have a lymphoma, and so forth. We actually go down on a molecular level now and look at these different tumor types down to a specific molecule or set of molecules that are expressed in these different diseases. That's part of what we want to have happen in ME/CFS, right? That's mainstreaming. Right now we're treating ME/CFS as a disease with a molecular basis. The other part of mainstreaming that's critically important is economics. And this has been something I think that's been missing from the discussion for a while. Dr. Peterson just gave you some wonderful numbers around the expenses of chronic fatigue. This is an estimate of the number of Americans, and excuse me, I couldn't find the international data on this because we have some national studies in the U.S. that track these things regularly, but it gives you an idea of 350 million Americans. So over half of them in 2015 now have, 2013, but have a chronic disease. That's staggering. Right? That's huge. And chronic diseases consume more than 75% of the healthcare budget. Right? So if ME/CFS, pick your estimates, ME/CFS is anywhere from 8 million to 19 million patients worldwide. The costs of that to society is staggering. That's the kind of numbers that we need to gather to drive some of these conversations forward on a political and on a funding front. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're trying to do that. So really part of what I think mainstreaming is about is acceptance of new ideas. And ME/CFS has not been a field where we've really pushed those ideas into the proper corners to get the attention that they deserve. So there's a process, and there's many different sort of diagrams around acceptance of ideas in both in science and otherwise. I just put one up here that I thought was particularly relevant to ME/CFS. So the initial stage of acceptance is that people dismiss it. It's irrelevant to what we're doing, right? We've definitely still have quite a bit of work to do there, and that this still happens on a daily basis. Then people start, as you mount evidence and start getting some data, people say, oh, it's relevant, but you haven't proven that yet, right? Well, we've seen that around the Rituxan trial that our Norwegian colleagues have done. And now we've started to move from that into phase 3, where it's proven, but it's dangerous, right? There's been some of that around even just the Rituxan trial, as well as the valsite work and so forth that we've done. Then we move to it's safe, but it'll never fly. And then we move on stage 5 to it'll sell, and what a great idea, and yeah, by the way, I thought of it, right? So...
What's the time span in it all?
Well, it depends on the problem, and it depends on how well of a sales job is done. And it depends on data, right? To get from that first step to the second or the third requires a lot of information and a lot of collaboration. And I've just told you how we can gather a lot of information, and we're starting to gather a lot of information. So let me continue on that thread, and I kind of did this slide already. There's intentionally nothing on this slide, because it's easy to ignore a problem when you don't have enough data, right? You don't have enough leverage to go at that problem. And part of what the Rituxan story, part of what the valsite story, part of what groups like Dr. Hornig and Dr. Lipkin in New York and Dan Peterson have been pushing is gathering that data to gain leverage and start to move this field in a new direction. I covered that already. So we have a lot of hypotheses. There were a lot of things that were kicked around yesterday at the meeting and continue to be thrown around, some of which have basis, many of which we're just are purely speculative, and many we're moving quickly into actual testable hypotheses and experiments. So we have a start on this in terms of MECFS. We have a lot of people who are willing to collaborate, and I think that is growing, and a big part of the challenge and a big part of the shift that we've seen in the last year is drawing new people in, and that's part of mainstreaming, is how do we get that immunologist, that virologist, that GI doc, that rheumatologist to work within the system rather than dismissing it. And I think data and understanding, and Dr. Peterson talked a little bit about the government aspect of getting understanding there. The FDA is not, I think some people present them as an enemy here. I think it's more of an issue, as Dr. Peterson pointed out, of ignorance and a lack of data from their perspective to be able to move something forward in this field. And it's unfortunate that it's there, but our job at this point, I think, is to bring that data to them and to bring it to them in large quantities where it can't be ignored. So we have measurements, and there's a lot of measurements, I've just gone over some of them, that haven't even been applied to chronic fatigue ME yet, and haven't been applied to a lot of areas, but I think there's a lot of value in doing that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And most importantly, we have you all who are willing and able to come to meetings like this and drive things forward in your own communities. And I think that's a critical piece. We've seen that time and time again, whether you're talking about HIV, whether you're talking about peptic ulcer disease, Alzheimer's, MS. These are all areas, and I spoke about this last year, where the driving force has been patients. And that's a tall order to ask for patients who are cognitively impaired and patients who are functionally impaired. But I think you all are doing very well in that category, better than most of us as physicians or researchers, I have to say. So what do we need? We need, to bring this into the mainstream, we need more measurement. We need broad measurement across lots and lots of patients so that we can characterize the disease better for groups like the FDA. We also need deep dives in, and you'll hear about some of those later today. We need deep dives on specific areas that are important to this particular disease, and we need engagement. Lots of you. That helps to get things done. That will move us from stage 1 all the way to stage 5 ultimately. So I'm going to start talking for a little bit and just tell you about what we're doing within OMI to try to help mainstream this in terms of a cause. Shortly after the meeting here last year, we convened another smaller group that we called the Merit Group for ME Roundtable on Immunology and Treatment. So in June of last year, we convened about 25 people, scientists, physicians from around the globe who either had a strong interest in, or we thought would be interesting to have at the table in terms of they brought something valuable to the discussion. And we brought them together for two and a half days in New York to talk science. But we didn't want to have it just be an academic meeting and have everybody sit down at a table, talk about what they were doing, and go home, and then be dealing with their local institutional issues and so forth again. What we really wanted to come out of that meeting, and I think we were very successful in doing that, was a list, a strategic plan, essentially, a list of targets, and utilizing and leveraging a lot of the technologies I just talked about. But how do we move chronic fatigue, ME, from being in this isolated area that it is into a mainstream research process? How do we get industry involved, both on the diagnostic side and on the pharma side? And I think the result was actually quite positive, very positive. We generated a list of, we limited it to about 10 projects. There were many more that were on our list, but we wanted to have a reasonable first start. And I don't think the strategic plan is going to give us all of the answers, but it will give us some major steps in the proper direction. And we wanted it to be an open and collaborative process, and have won additional converts to support the plan worldwide now, which has been great. And as I said, it remains an open process, so we welcome any physicians or scientists to join that. In particular, we wanted a process, as I said, that really was going to start to drive things forward. And the thing that floated to the top was a large international multi-center trial with rituximab. Unfortunately, that was also the biggest price tag. So the dollar amount that we came up with, so we had a list of things we wanted to do. We figured out what it would take to do them, how much we thought it would cost, and who would start to be doing them. So who are the best people we can grab to do these various things. And that came out to about $13.5 million, as many of you may have read when we announced it publicly in mid-January. The first one on the list, not necessarily the first one chronologically to go into, was a large multi-center trial. So that will be an international trial. We may have a Valcyte arm on that in combination with Rituxan. We're looking at least 150 patients, but we've been asking several other groups for significantly more, because I think it's important to do that to further validate it. We've received some partial funding on that already and are working with some of the other investigators in that area. So problem number 2 is actually, I think, the key piece of infrastructure that we're missing in chronic fatigue. We have these little siloed registries and biobanks. We are putting out there now an international effort to register patients. We're targeting at least 20,000 plus in our first pass to do on the online side, and then we'll pull samples from a large number of those. We've got partial funding for this already. All data stays confidential. You get to control who sees what, and you'll ultimately get access to your own data. The samples will remain in a biobank. We're using a sort of a distributed model, but we want some standardization around how it's collected and some scientific control around that. And then we can parcel those out to some of the scientists and experts for specific testing, and you'll hear about some of those in Dr. Hornik's talk. We've also had other groups donate into this process in terms of in-kind donations. So we had a company called Brain Resources donate 5,000 cognitive measurements. So these are online tests that some of you all hopefully will go online and do for us, maybe pre and post treatment, maybe just as a baseline. But this was a great step forward for us. So we're sort of using this as an incentive to get some baseline measurements and then measure some interesting groups, again, from a very quantitative perspective, mainstreaming that result. We also had a donation from a local company in Silicon Valley. It's actually a global company with 10,000 plus employees that does virtualization software. And so they're giving us actually technical support to increase our infrastructure to be able to measure some of these things and do some of these things online and so forth. So that was a great things. So this is all in support of our infrastructure called OpenMedNet, and I'll have something at the end, again, connecting some of these mobile devices we've been talking about, cell phones, voice phones, SMS texting, back-end data from lab systems and clinics and hospitals and so forth. I'm not going to talk more about that. Merit Project 3 is a protein studies, so that colorful protein array that I showed you, we have 2 companies actually giving us testing for large proteins and small molecules essentially as a donation. And we're continuing to look at other technologies to really start to dig into on a large scale these kinds of measurements. We're piloting some studies with existing drugs. Dr. Peterson already talked about drug repurposing, so that's a big issue here, but now we're talking also about measurement alongside of those. So these are retrospective and prospective studies. Immune biomarkers, this is the low-hanging fruit. You've heard, and you'll hear some more today about NKs and B cells and T cell assays, but also down onto the molecular level of what are the proteins and signatures on a gene expression level that are going on in these cells, and how do they change with different treatments. DNA studies, we can thank the Edward P. Evans Foundation here for fully funding this project. So we're actually already going with doing whole genome sequencing on a set of patients. We're going to do about 1,000 HLA sequences, which is the immune part of your genome, and look at DNA methylation, which is part of how we look at, or people think about control of different genes within the genome. So we have a lot of folks lining up for this, and if you or physicians, some of you are physicians or researchers out there, want to send us folks for that, by all means, please contact us. We will look also with Project 7 at environmental measures and metabolomics. Project 8 is about pathogen testing, mostly viral, but we will probably look at a few others, and you're going to hear a lot of detail about that from Dr. Hornig, who's been doing some interesting projects related to that, and we're working closely with them, her and Dr. Lipkin's group. Project 9 is sort of a deeper dive on immunology. And Project 10, which also has some of its sub-projects funded already, are small pilot studies around naturally occurring substances that many of you use already, and we want to really document whether and when some of these substances are useful and important to use. So we had a trial that was funded by the NIDA Foundation on moringa. So besides merit, which is a big set of tasks, there's a lot more things that we've been doing, and I'll spend 2 minutes talking about that, and then I'll be done. We are the lead institution with running a CDC study. There's 7 sites in the CDC study. Our network is 5 of them, including Dr. Peterson is one of our key collaborators on this, which has been a really great experience for us in terms of applying OpenMedNet, which is our infrastructure, to that process and seeing how that worked. So we just collected data from 500 patients, roughly, actually 450 patients, across a panel of things that the CDC asked us to measure in those patients. And in that project's now ongoing for this year as well, and we'll add biological sampling and some other things to that. We're working with a bunch of molecular diagnostic companies. One of the most notable is Cepheid. This is a $100 million company that has molecular testing on pathogens. They have an instrument that does this, and we're hoping that actually should any of the collaborators be able to identify a pathogen signal, we might be able to very quickly put it into one of their modules, which basically gives you a test result within an hour if you've set it up correctly. So this is a nice, again, mainstream pathway. This is an instrument that's being used worldwide in 4,000 sites for TB testing, for STD testing, for influenza testing. So this would be a great tool to have on the clinical front, and a nice way to sort of quantify this on a global level. I talked a lot about different sensor devices. I'm not going to talk more about that. Perhaps the biggest project we have going, actually I'm going to spend the least time talking about because it's just getting going, but it's been a real breakthrough for us, has been using these, again, in a mainstream medicine kind of way, using a lot of these tools to redefine how we track and look at patients and people's health with an insurance company, actually. So we took over the wellness program for an insurance company, about 300,000 members in their purview. We're looking at a subset of that initially, but we get all the data from the insurance company, and then we can communicate with the patient directly, and they can opt into the research process if they'd like to, but we get all of their blood work and so forth. And, well, 300,000 patients, figure about 1 in 300 or 1 in 400 have CFS, so we just picked up about 1,000 CFS patients and have a very keen look on their healthcare data, utilization data. So we can help that insurance company guide those CFS patients in a much more directed way than we ever could have before, and guide them down a path that the CFS patient, the ME patient, goes towards a better quality outcome. So whether we're fully fixing the problem or not, we're at the very least keeping that patient out of the hospital and keeping them out of the emergency room and delivering on some of their needs, while we're hopefully, for the insurance plan, lowering some of those costs and using that money towards research. So it's a nice win-win all the way around, and we can feed that data back to the clinician who's trying to treat those patients. So we hope that that project, and hopefully I can tell you more about that in the future, really takes off and provides a model for a lot of different healthcare systems. And then finally, we're looking at a lot of related neuroimmune diseases. So we have similar projects running now in autism, in Lyme, in MS, and some other related fatigue diseases. So we hope to leverage those to get, again, more data, more measurement, more comparisons across. So really, I think mainstreaming, when it comes down to it, is about enabling the crowd. And part of what we wanted to do was invite you all to participate in that. And so we have a website. It's in the brochure somewhere, I think. So this is the OpenMedNet site, and there's a specific pre-registration login page. We'll turn this on live over the summer, probably about a month or so from now. But you can pre-register already. It's just putting in your email address, essentially, as a patient, as a healthy control, so you can encourage your friends or family who are not sick to, they're almost as important to have those people in, because they're a lot harder to reach sometimes. So we'll be asking different groups different questions, but a lot of the same questions as well. So I invite you, our goal is tens of thousands of individuals, so would love to have your help with that. And with that, I'll close just to thank Linda Tannenbaum, who's from the foundation side, who's been doing a fabulous job in terms of fundraising, Edward P. Evans Foundation and IIME for the opportunity here, and all of our merit participants, and I just listed the ones who are here at this meeting. Special thanks to them, because they've been some of the most engaged folks I've ever worked with. And I'll close with that, and I don't know if we have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Andreas, indeed. Thank you.